Hi, everyone. Good to see you all. I really appreciate you showing up, especially because I know many of you heard about this on short notice. How's the sound on this thing? Are you all picking it up okay? Good, thank you. I'm going to start from the assumption that access and accommodations are good things, necessary even. Everyone who's part of the university community, faculty and staff, students, visitors, and alumni all have the right to whatever access and accommodations they need to navigate their environments. But although they're necessary, access and accommodations are not by themselves sufficient. I want to make the argument today that we need to move beyond them. I make this argument with the full recognition that some of my disabled and other marginalized colleagues may believe that I'm getting ahead of myself. We haven't yet reached the point that everyone has the necessary access and accommodations. There's a common misconception that the laws passed to prevent discrimination, especially in the case of disabled people protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, do in fact prevent discrimination. That's not true, and it's well documented. I don't see a need to offer evidence for it here. The point I want to make now is that we cannot give someone a required accommodation or offer them a seat at the table and then check off the box and decide we're done. Why isn't that enough? The best answer I've heard to that question comes from J. Logan Smilgis's book, Crip Negativity. Quote, "In my case," Smilgis says, "nothing about my education was inaccessible. I could get into the building, into all of my classes. I could understand the lessons and complete the assignments. I had a range of extracurricular activities I could choose from and participate in if I wanted. I had teachers who offered a variety of formal and informal accommodations to help me fulfill course objectives. And yet, despite all this access, ableism still managed to make my life absolutely fucking miserable." End quote. I do not want us to be ableist, and I do not want our students to be absolutely fucking miserable. Setting aside the obvious moral, ethical, and empathetic issues at play here, and I think those really are the critical issues, but even if we do set them aside, just looking at the requirements of my job, it's my job to teach my students. I can't teach them if they're too miserable to focus on what I want them to learn. And I can't teach them if they drop out, which they might well, if they're miserable in this environment. Smilgis is both queer and neurodivergent. He calls himself, quote, neuroqueer, end quote. He is now a professor. The message of his book reminds me of a sentence from a student's online discussion post. Quote, "It's not enough to give students a seat in the classroom. They have to believe they belong there," end quote. That was written by Tasha Rentis, a former student of mine, who is now a graduate student in rhetoric and composition at the University of Central Florida. Like Smilgis, they are both queer and neurodivergent. I agree strongly with them. If students don't believe they belong, they may not stay. They certainly won't do their best work while they're here. So this is an issue of student retention, among other things, and also faculty and staff retention, much of which I say here applies to them too. It may not be clear how much it applies to me. I'm a straight, white, cis man. I look like a stereotypical English professor. If that's what you're thinking, it's fair. I'm very much aware of my intersectional privilege. And yet, I'm writing these words on March 5th, 2025. 5 years ago, on March 5th, 2020, the COVID pandemic was spiraling out of control. Businesses were closing and schools were about to go online. I didn't know any of that. I was in the hospital recovering from surgery to address stage 4 squamous cell carcinoma originating in my tongue. I lost my entire tongue, both the oral part you can see in the mouth and also the base of the tongue further back, as well as much of the floor of my mouth, all my lower teeth, various sections of my neck and throat, and other less important body parts. I have not since then spoken a clear word or eaten a bite of solid food. I also haven't taught a course in person. I teach entirely online now. Over the last couple of years, I've gotten to the point where I can speak well, enough that my kids can understand me. No one else really can, which is why you're not hearing my voice today. For speaking in my place, I'd like to thank Dr. Shane Wood, professor of writing and rhetoric at UCF, who would be my colleague now if I hadn't come here. But given that we never actually worked together, I'm immensely grateful to him for volunteering to take this on, and I hope it doesn't make him feel strange to read these lines. I should clarify that it is possible for most people with total glossectomies, after sufficient therapy, to speak clearly enough to be understood even by people who don't know them. When my oncologist pointed this out to me, I wrote on my whiteboard, quote, "How many of them are profoundly deaf?" End quote. I became deaf when I was 4 as a result of meningitis. What you see on this slide is a fairly typical audiogram from me. It's from 2012, but that doesn't matter much. It represents my hearing pretty well over the last 51 years. You'll note that there's only one set of symbols. It's from my right ear. My left ear has detected no sound since I was 4. Even my right ear is below the level of the things you see here listed on the right, such as traffic or smoke alarms or lawnmowers. I have a lot of stories about smoke alarms. I had to delete them for reasons of time, so just trust me that it's been tested on more than one occasion. I cannot detect the sound of a smoke alarm without my hearing aid, and I certainly can't hear traffic or lawnmowers. But again, that's without my hearing aid. With my hearing aid, if I'm within a couple of meters of you, I can see your face well and you're speaking clearly. I can understand you just fine. In a situation like we're in here or in the classrooms where I used to teach, I don't need captioning. I may actually be better off communicating as I do here than if I were listening across the room, as many hearing teachers do. If you raise your hand and I walk up to you and look you straight, you're not likely to wonder if I really am listening to you. Disability scholars have offered many models of disability, and I'll be discussing some of them in a moment. For now, though, I want to explain how my own disabilities highlight the radical difference between the two most common models, the medical model and the social model. Medically speaking, my loss of hearing and my loss of speech are completely unrelated. One of them was caused by meningitis when I was 4, and the other was caused by cancer when I was 50. One resulted from nerve damage in my ears, and one resulted from tissue damage in my mouth and throat. They have nothing to do with each other. Socially, however, they're not only related, but conflated. People expect someone who's unable to hear to be also unable to speak. The ASL sign for deaf literally means can't hear, can't speak. And while there are activists who want to change that sign, their concern is the negativity suggested there, defining deafness by what deaf people can't do. Not that the lack of speech is included in the sign. Before I lost my tongue, people often didn't view me as really deaf because I could speak. And if I misunderstood something, they took that as a sign that they needed to repeat it, not that I was inherently unable to understand them. Now people view me as actually deaf. If I misunderstand something they say, they immediately give up on trying to talk with me and shift over to writing. But cancer had no effect on my hearing at all. This conflation of my disabilities is most obvious in people I've just met, but I also see it in people I've known for a while. I'll write something on my whiteboard, hand it to someone I spent years talking to, and they'll take the whiteboard and write back. So although most people seeing me would not immediately assume my presence in an organization would contribute to its diversity, my situation does sometimes lead to confusion. People aren't quite sure what to make of me. I implied earlier that ableism can make even faculty feel miserable, and it's occurred to me that you might be wondering if I'm in that position. Those of you who work with me might even be wondering if I'm talking about you. I hope you're not, but just in case, let me set your mind at rest. The answer is no to both of those. I am not generally miserable at my job. I like it very much here. And if you're someone I've worked with in the English department or the UDAC, I've been quite happy with how things have been going with you. That's actually a huge reason I took this job. I interviewed at another institution at the same time I interviewed here. The other institution threw all sorts of accommodations my way, including some I didn't need, such as ASL interpreters I don't sign. I'm positive that the people on that search committee believed they were meeting my needs perfectly, but I did not feel welcome there. I kept getting definite senses of frustration when the communication didn't go perfectly smoothly. And the director I would have been working under made obvious that the department saw online education as inherently inferior to in-person education. They had few online classes and they were working on getting rid of those. Let me be clear on this. If you say you don't have a problem with my disabilities, but you reject the value of the work I do because of my disabilities, then we have a problem, and I don't want to work for you. There was a time when I thought I'd be taking the other position. On paper, it was a better match for my specific skill set, and there was no question that I'd get whatever accommodations I asked for, but accommodations are not enough. I'm certain that I would not have been happy there. The people I met in the English department here, on the other hand, did not merely allow me a seat at the table, they genuinely seemed to want me to have it. But although most of the people I've met here have been wonderful, we all have room to improve. I absolutely include myself in that. And to that end, I want to talk a bit more about the models of disability because they help us understand what accommodations are, how they work, and how we can move beyond them to a post-accommodation world. There are a great many of these models, and they're explained in a variety of ways. J. Logan Smilges, whose work I mentioned earlier, mentioned several. Molly Margaret Kessler has an extensive discussion of them in Stigma Stories. And nearly every treatment of the subject mentions both the medical and social models. For my purposes, the difference in the models is in where disability resides. In the medical model, it resides in the body. My disabilities are in my mouth and throat, and in the nerves in my ear. In the social model, disability resides in society. The problem isn't that my tongue is missing or my nerves are dead. It's that society isn't set up well to meet my needs. My own preference is what I call the gap model. Disability resides in the gap between where you are and where you want to be. That gap may be caused by any combination of physical, social, economic, political, or environmental issues. An accommodation is anything that acts as a bridge over the gap. But bridging a gap isn't the ideal way of closing it, even if it's sometimes the best realistic option we have. Let's approach this from a metaphorical perspective. Let's say I'm out for a walk and I come across a river of quicksand. That's what this slide shows. Now, quicksand has proven to be much less of a problem in my adult life than I thought it would be as a child watching Tarzan movies. But it works as a metaphor here. It creates a gap between where I am and where I want to be. That's literally a disability. I do not have the ability to keep walking across this gap. How do we solve that? Well, one way would be to bridge the gap. We can make a bridge from here to here. And that would allow me to cross the quicksand without getting stuck, without even getting my feet wet or dirty. But it's not the ideal solution. Given the appropriate resources, it would be better to drain the quicksand, replace it with fertile ground, and turn it into this. This flower garden isn't a gap at all. I can just walk on through wherever I feel like passing. I don't have to go out of my way to get to the bridge. What we have now is a post-accommodation environment. No accommodation is necessary here, and it's not just helpful for people with disabilities. Everyone can enjoy the garden. Well, almost everyone. Some people will be held back by allergies or other issues. No environment is truly ideal for everyone. And this approach doesn't always even meet its potential for anyone. After all, it takes remarkable resources to turn a quicksand river into a flower garden. It's not always feasible or even possible to do so. Again, we've been speaking metaphorically. How does that play out in real life? I think it can help us understand what makes an accommodation and what makes a post-accommodation environment. Within the deaf community, having sign language interpreters in a classroom would be an example of an accommodation. It bridges the gap that keeps them from knowing what's being said in the classroom. But it doesn't erase that gap. For that to happen, the deaf students would need to be in a classroom where everyone could sign fluently. No interpreters would be needed. Everyone could understand directly what everyone else was signing. On a related note, the perspective sheds light on the question of what counts as a disability. Is deafness a disability? Many people in the deaf community say no, and for them it isn't. They're in their own community and their own people who have their own language and culture. There's no gap between where they are and where they want to be. By the standards of the gap model, then there's no disability. But deafness is a disability within the hearing world. I'm not a member of the deaf community. As I've mentioned, I don't sign. I'm familiar with deaf culture only from studying it in books and talking with a few people about it. I was raised in the hearing world, and in that world, my deafness creates all sorts of gaps between where I am and where I want to be. It would create even more gaps in the deaf community. Medically speaking, I'm indistinguishable from the deaf people in the deaf community. Socially, however, I'm radically different. I'm not saying there is no way to erase the gaps in my world. Like the people in the deaf community, I find that some approaches lead to accommodations that merely bridge the gaps and some lead to erasing them. Let's consider two accommodations the university offers me: captioners for meetings and online teaching. As far as the university is concerned, they're both accommodations. They're special things I'm given because I'm considered disabled, and they're meant to help me do my job in spite of my disability. There's no difference as far as the university is concerned, except that the captioners cost more. Their role in my life, however, is fundamentally different. Let's start with the captioners. They're there to address a disability, specifically that I can't hear what goes on at meetings. That creates a gap between where I am and where I want to be. I want to be in a situation where I know what's going on. The captioners bridge the gap there, but they don't erase it. They can't. There are still inherent limitations to my ability to function the same way other people would. It takes time for captioners to hear a message and transcribe it, time for me to read it, and a lot of time for me to compose a response in writing. In that time, the conversation can shift direction and we'll no longer be talking about what I wanted to comment on. There's no practical way to put me on the same footing as everyone else in the room. Teaching online is fundamentally different from being in a room with live captioning. It is not functionally an accommodation at all. It's the flower garden. When I'm there, I'm in the same position as anyone else doing the work. There's no gap between where I am and where I want to be. This environment isn't just nice for me, it's nice for most of my students. That's something that comes up in the first week's discussion in almost every class. There are actual advantages to learning online. By this, I don't just mean there are reasons to do it if you can't get something better. I mean, this is something better. I'm going to share 3 quotations from student discussion post. The prompt was to share their ideas on what makes a good class discussion, whether online or in person. I did not specifically ask about the advantages of either. Here's the first quotation. Quote, "When you have the pressure to respond immediately to your classmates, I believe that the quality of the discussion won't be as high and engaging. Whereas if students can make their initial post and then read through their peers' work at their own pace, I think people will be able to respond with more thought and find ways to keep the conversation going more productively." End quote. I think this one is critical. Many students find it difficult to speak up at all during in-person discussions because they're required to think quickly and speak off the cuff. They don't control the pace in the same way they do when they can compose a response carefully. Here's the second quotation. Quote, I think having online discussions is much easier. You can say what you are thinking or feeling, and you don't have to have that nervousness or fear of speaking your thoughts in front of others and fearing what others think, end quote. Completely aside from the time constraint, many students and other people simply aren't comfortable speaking in front of a group. Granting that this is an important skill, I think it's a skill that can be learned in other classes. I see some benefit in being able to focus on your ideas, not on overcoming your fear of public speaking. This third quotation from a different class offers another phrasing. Quote, I do not typically enjoy in-person discussions in an academic setting because I am somewhat of a shy person, so I appreciate that when we are able to participate in discussions online. I feel as if I have more time to think about what I truly want to say or add to the conversation, end quote. Setting aside the discussions and looking at online education more broadly, the advantages seem especially well suited to writing classes. People learn to do things in part by doing the things, or by doing something as much like the things as possible. I came to realize this point very quickly in 1997, when I took a job working with the online training programs at Cerner Corporation, a medical software company. We wanted to train people to use computers. We were using computers to do that. We couldn't have the learners work with the actual environment they'd be using on the job because it had real patient data. But we could build simulations. By working within these simulations, they were able to see exactly what the programs would look like and how they would respond. They ended up learning more than if they'd been sitting in a class listening to a lecture on it. The same thing happens when writing, except it's not a simulation. It's the real thing. People really do write with computers. And when they're completing writing assignments online, they're doing exactly the same thing they'll be doing in almost any other writing situation. And it's not just the practice that's based on writing, it's the content. When I taught in person, we spent a lot of time talking and listening to each other talk about writing. Now, all that interaction takes place through writing. My students are practicing writing at the same time they're discussing it with me and each other. And this is true for any deaf students I have, any students in wheelchairs, any blind students, any students who need extra time to complete their assignments, any students whose phobias or mobility issues make it difficult for them to leave their home. In most cases, these students don't even need to disclose any disabilities they have. Their disabilities are irrelevant to the class, just as mine are. I'm very open about mine. It's a lot easier for me to do my job if my students and colleagues know I won't be able to speak to them, and if they know how to talk to me effectively. But this is a personal choice. My students should have the right to that choice too. Many of you are probably seeing the situation I describe here as an example of universal design for learning. If you don't, or if you're not familiar with it, let me briefly explain that universal design is a concept that originally comes from architecture. The classic example is curb cuts, which in addition to allowing people in wheelchairs to move over curbs more easily, also allow people with strollers or shopping carts to do the same. Putting this in the context of learning, when I was interviewing at Cerner and they were telling me about all the online training they were developing, I asked, what will you do if the learner can't hear? And my soon-to-be team leader stared at me for a moment and said, you know, Tom, we never thought of that. That's why I believe we need discussions like this. I want us all to be in the habit of thinking about what deaf and hard of hearing people need, what blind people need, what queer people need, what people of color need. Sometimes that's hard to know. Sometimes it isn't. A moment's thought about how deaf people would approach the online training modules by anyone on the Cerner team would have made them realize captioning was necessary. And once it was added, its benefit was not limited to deaf or hard of hearing people. Remember, Cerner is a medical software company. The training covered a great many technical terms. Even for people with perfect hearing, it's something helpful to see those in writing. That's how universal design works. I want to emphasize, by the way, that I'm not criticizing Cerner for its failures to consider the need for captioning. This was 28 years ago and everyone was still figuring out this whole online education thing. But now it's 2025 and we're at the point where we've run out of excuses for failing to provide accommodations like this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on UDL for a couple of reasons. One is that my goal here is primarily to encourage new ways of thinking, like what the Cerner team could have used. It's not so much to set forth specific things to do. Another is that if you are looking for specific things to do, UNR already has excellent resources on that. You can turn to the Office of Digital Learning's information on accessibility resources. As you can see on this slide, it gives you captioning resources and accessibility training sessions, among other things. There's also a really nice piece in Nevada Today on UDL. It's from a couple of years ago, but still highly relevant. Quote, "Universal design for learning helps all students connect with course materials to become expert learners," end quote. If you're completely new to UDL, I'd recommend starting here. Still, another reason I don't want to spend too much time on UDL is that although it can contribute to a post-accommodation world, much of it strikes me as being about having basic accommodations. And as you know by now, I want to go beyond that. Still, if we step away from the UDL checklist, making sure your materials are readable by people who are colorblind, making sure your videos have accurate captioning, that sort of thing, and look at what it's really about, it can give some important insights on how to think through best possible experiences for various marginalized groups. The approach goes all the way up to the core of course design. Consider this line from a course evaluation. Quote, "I have ADHD and the course had the perfect balance of structure and freedom for me to have guidelines to do well, but to also think for myself and figure out how best I can learn with the materials and assignments provided," end quote. That was not an accident. I began my career working with students in Southern Illinois University's Clinical Center Achieve program, which offers services to students with learning disabilities, ADHD, and other learning differences. The principles I worked with there apply more broadly, and they still influence how I design my classes. The balance this student mentions is something I strive for, but it is not something that always works. You'll recall I mentioned earlier that even flower gardens don't appeal to everyone. No environment is always ideal, so you have to be ready to change it. I had an autistic student a couple of years ago who struggled with figuring out how they could best learn with the materials and assignments provided. One assignment in particular was simply overwhelming for them. They didn't know where to start. So I met with them to discuss their needs and then rewrote the assignment. I was careful to make sure it had the same requirements as every other student would be meeting, but these requirements were described in a way that worked for this student. They ended up doing very well on the assignment, and having gotten a better feel for my thinking in assignment design, they turned down my offers to do the same for later assignments. I believe that's the kind of design consideration we need to keep in mind if we want to create courses that allow students with or without ADHD or autism to meet their potential. And I found that online classes are ideal environments for helping an amazing variety of students do that. This idea that online education can actually be better in some ways than in-person education, and that we should design our classes to capitalize on those advantages, is one part of a larger point I want to make. One of the best ways to reach a variety of people in a variety of situations is to look at what's working and make it work better. This was the primary idea behind my senior honors thesis, Teaching English to the Profoundly Deaf. Literacy rates among deaf students are far below those of hearing students. They don't need to be. A huge part of the problem is that deaf students are framed as students with inferior hearing, so when their teachers apply the same methods used for hearing students, they get inferior results. But there are major advantages to being deaf when it comes to developing literacy. One of the most obvious is that deaf people with good reading skills have a great deal of incentive to practice them and learn to read even better. We can't learn about the world very well by hearing other people talk about it. we turn to the written word instead. So whether we're talking about deaf education or online education, we're in a situation where many people tend to view it as inferior to more common ways of learning. And there are indeed limitations, but focusing on those limitations won't get our students as far as pointing out their strengths and using those as our foundation. The same thing happens on a much smaller scale when we're working with individual students. I can't possibly count the number of students who have sat down to discuss a draft with me and told me it was terrible. And in some ways, sometimes they were right. That's fine. And Lamont has a highly regarded essay called Shitty First Drafts. It's okay for drafts to be shitty. But even shitty drafts often have something beautiful in them. So I'll be reading along and say, let's take a look at your supporting claim at the bottom of page 3. I find it fascinating. To me, it's actually more insightful than your primary claim. The student usually agrees and quite often shifts their focus to that point. I do have to offer a word of caution about this approach. Back in 1991, in my first year of teaching, I had a student who brought up what I thought was an impressive idea buried in the middle of her paper. I praised it over and over. She wrote the final version of her paper about it. I gave it an excellent grade. But then I read her reflection in which she said she was actually wanted to take her paper in a different direction when she revised it and wrote the paper she did only because she thought I wanted it. So I think it's important to keep student agency in mind here, and ever since then I've made a point of asking students their view on whatever ideas struck me about their work. Even though my focus at the moment is on my students, I do want to mention that as a teacher, I see this as a huge benefit to being thoughtful and assigning reflections. When done well, they can not only help students become more conscious of their learning, they can help teachers adjust their teaching. I am not, by the way, presenting this broader approach merely as a pedagogical technique to get students to write better papers. It can do that. But I think it's more important that it shows students they really do have valuable ideas that they can expand on, ideas worth sharing not only in their original form, but in a more developed one. And students who understand this, regardless of their identity, are more likely to have a positive experience in their classes, more likely to stay engaged, and more likely to stay enrolled. I've been talking quite a bit about composition. I want to shift over to literature for a moment for the benefit of my colleagues who teach that. I like to think about it from the standpoint of representation. How can we make students feel represented in their classes? One obvious answer is to have them read the voices of marginalized authors, ideally writing about marginalized characters. So you might have them read Toni Morrison's Scylla or Amy Tan's Mother Tongue. I think that's a wonderful idea. But I think it's also important to get students into the habit of finding marginalized aspects where they're not obvious, even in the works of the DOWGs, the dead old white guys. And to be clear, I have nothing against dead old white guys. I plan to be one myself someday. I just think that students should also be reading things by people who don't look like me. Given that some of the most widely read remarks or works are by the DOWGs, though, it's good to be able to read them for representation. How many of you have read Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn? How many of you read it in a class where they discussed race? How about in a class where they discussed deafness? I want to draw your attention to this scene. Jim is telling Huck about a time when he treated his daughter, Elizabeth, unfairly.
I'm not going to read this slide. It shows Twain's depictions of Jim's dialect, and I don't want to misrepresent that. To paraphrase it, however, Jim explains that Elizabeth contracted scarlet fever when she was 4. After she got better, Jim told her to shut a door. She ignored him. Jim became angry at her for that, but then the wind blew the door shut hard, and she ignored that too. Realizing that something was wrong, he crept up behind her and yelled, "Pow!" She didn't budge. At that point, he knew she was deaf and felt enormous guilt at having treated her as he did.
Elizabeth, like me, was 4 years old when she became deaf. And Elizabeth, like me, didn't say anything about it. She didn't ask anyone why she could no longer hear. Neither did I. And Elizabeth, like me, was mistreated by someone who felt the need to test her hearing by talking to her. My case was much less abusive than hers. It was still annoying, though, to my mother anyway. I didn't know it was happening. My doctors would try to trick me by saying things like, "Would you like some ice cream?" And my mother would roll her eyes and tell them, he really cannot hear you. This is not the only discussion of deafness of the book. I don't have time to get into the others or why I find them significant. For my purposes, I don't need to. My goal is simply to ask you to look for these sorts of things yourself. And they're everywhere. Consider how disability works in the Star Wars movies. The price of becoming a Jedi is high. If you take that path, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg, or maybe some other combination of limbs. I really don't remember who all lost what limbs. But I'm inclined to wonder if that really is presented as such a great cost and what that says about the view of disability in the Star Wars universe. I mean, can we really say that Darth Vader is disabled, given his incredible power, both physical and otherwise? Is this the position we want disabled people to be in? I don't mean becoming an evil dictator who blows up planets in front of their princesses, but coming out of a disabling experience with such strength. I don't have an answer for that, but it's the kind of question I think we need to be asking. Getting back to Huckleberry Finn, it was published in 1885. 10 years later, Twain met a 14-year-old girl named Helen Keller. In spite of their age difference, they became lifelong friends. Keller had quite a bit to say about why she appreciated him. The first is a line that's widely quoted on the internet, but I haven't been able to find the original, so be aware of that. Quote, "He treated me not as a freak, but as a handicapped woman seeking a way to circumvent extraordinary difficulties." End quote. I want to contrast this with the situation of Logan Smilgis mentioned at the beginning of this talk. His classmates didn't treat him as a freak. That's obviously not the approach we want. But there's something else happening. Keller didn't say Twain treated her like everyone else. This was not the equivalent of saying, "I don't see color." It's a matter of seeing and valuing her differences. And although the phrasing Keller used might be considered problematic in current terms, I think that's a critical distinction to make. I don't want you all to see me as being just like a hearing or speaking person. I want you to interact with me in the ways that work best for both of us. This is not about seeking equality. It's about seeking equity. Most often, when my students tell me about a professor's failure to meet their needs, it's because the professor believes all students need to be treated the same way. That's simply untrue. If you try to treat me as if I could speak or hear or eat normally, that will create issues. I'm going to conclude with these lines from a source I was able to track down. Helen Keller is talking about why she appreciated Mark Twain. Quote, "He never made me feel that my opinions were worthless, as so many people do." End quote. I want to stop there for a moment. Helen Keller is today known as a famously brilliant person. Even during her lifetime, she was a successful author and lecturer. If even she felt that many people found her opinions worthless, how much easier is it to believe that some of our students must feel the same way? Keller continues, quote, "He knew that we do not think with eyes and ears, and that our capacity for thought is not measured by 5 senses. He always kept me in mind while he talked, and he treated me as a competent human being. That is why I loved him." End quote. Quoted in Helen Keller, A Life by Dorothy Herman. He treated me as a competent human being. That seems like such a low bar. Many people Helen Keller associated with didn't pass it though. And I've had a lot of students tell me about a lot of cases in which their professors didn't pass it. Some of these students were queer or trans or physically disabled or neurodivergent or people of color. Some weren't members of any marginalized group I knew of, but that said, nothing about any group I may not have known of, and regardless, they had the right to be treated as competent human beings. Like Jim, I have myself had cause to regret how I've treated people I've misunderstood. I'm hoping we can open a discussion to head off that problem a little bit better moving forward. I've covered a lot of ground that you may have comments or questions on. Instead of asking anything specific then, what I'd like to do is hand this over to you. Again, raise your hands and I'll walk over to you and listen.